also to a woman who founded Fair Fight Action, who has done more to register voters and protect our precious voting rights here in Georgia. That person being my good friend Stacey Abrams. And I want to thank Fair Fight Action for bringing us together today for this crucial democracy summit. Today, as we reflect on the 59th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, we find ourselves at a crossroads in our fight for democracy. It's important that we remember how far we've come and how vigilant we must be in the fight for free and fair elections for all Americans. 59 years ago, the Voting Rights Act aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented Black people from exercising their precious right to vote. But today we see those hard-won rights under attack again and again across our nation and right here in Georgia, which for some reason has taken the lead in voter suppression among state legislatures throughout the country. Voter suppression laws have been passed to make access to the ballot more difficult for millions of people across our state. It's crucial that we pass federal voting rights protections. We are seeing right now, here in our communities, why Congress must act. And it's unfortunate that Congress must act because of a ruling by the United States Supreme Court back in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, which eviscerated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which then neutered Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. The coverage formula was gutted. And since then, state legislatures have had free rein to impose voting regulations without any kind of review, and they've done that with the express purpose to suppress votes of some of their electorate. One of the most egregious and flagrant abuses of power is the new, deeply politicized Georgia State Elections Board, which is advancing changes to our election rules that could severely impact our democratic processes. In the shadows of Trump's 2020 big lie, the MAGA-aligned members of the Georgia State Election Board have been working aggressively to manipulate our elections. With less than 100 days to the election, these members held an unlawful meeting to ram through rule changes designed to sow distrust and delay the certification of election results. This isn't just bureaucracy at work, ladies and gentlemen. It's a deliberate attempt to sabotage the fairness of our elections. These rule changes, proposed under the guise of so-called election integrity, could overburdened election workers and give local elections officials more power to refuse certification based on alleged irregularities. This move towards discretionary power to certify Georgia elections directly contradicts state law, which states the duties of local election officials to certify election results is obligatory and not optional. We're gathered here not just to discuss these challenges, but to reaffirm our commitment to freedom and democracy. As we face these modern-day voter suppression efforts, let us draw strength from our history, from the brave leaders who came before us to protect our freedom to vote, and from the lessons of the Voting Rights Act. Let's stand united to ensure that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. Our response must be clear and forceful. We need to mobilize voters, and we need to work for a large turnout to ensure decisive victories that leave no room for doubt or manipulation. We must also engage in grassroots efforts to protect voters and maintain the integrity of our elections. we must make sure that we don't have to be dependent on the United States Post Office. And so therefore, in-person voting is something that I believe we should stress over mail-in voting. The path forward is not just through organizing and community outreach, but through active civic engagement and voter education, which is what is taking place today. While the presidential race will be at the forefront of our minds going into November, I want to emphasize the equally critical importance of our local elections. Local elections are where the rubber meets the road. The mayors, city council members, county commissioners, school board officials, sheriffs, district attorneys, and judges who we elect have direct and immediate impact on our daily lives. They decide on policy that affects our children's education, the safety of our streets, and the cleanliness of our parks and the fairness of our justice system. Today, let us pledge to continue the fight for fair elections and to uphold the principles of the Voting Rights Act enshrined into law. It is our duty to safeguard democracy for the next generation, just as it was the duty of those 59 years ago to lay the groundwork for us. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And as we say in the House, I yield back.
And thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being in the fight. Thank you so much for understanding this is a fight that is well worth it. And this is a panel that's going to help lay out the cost of that fight and why we fight. And what, I wasn't direct enough?
There you are.
Okay. And hello, my name is Carol Anderson. I'm the Robert Woodruff Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and I am a member of the Fair Fight Board. And I'd like for my panelists to introduce themselves before we get going.
Good afternoon. My name is James Darnell McCorder. I am a resident of DeKalb County. I am a veteran, and I am a entrepreneur, and I also work for DeKalb County Sanitation at headquarters. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay. I guess I'm the shortest one on the panel. I'm Kathy Willard. I am the former board chair of the Fulton County Board of Elections, Board of Registration and Elections. I'm also the former Atlanta City Council president and an Atlanta City Council member. I've run for office multiple times, so I've been a candidate in elections, and I'm also an advocate and have worked in many issues related to saving democracy. So I kind of have a 360 on these issues.
My name is Richard Porter. I'm a citizen of Gwinnett County, and I'm a second retiree, first from the Bell system and second from the Gwinnett County Public Library. And I'm a child of Mississippi. Grew up in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. So I have a long memory and a long history with this.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Helen Butler, Executive Director of the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda, a nonprofit founded by the late Dr. Joseph Eccles Lowry, and I'm also a former member of the Morgan County Board of Elections.
And let me lay out some of the rules that we're going to work with here. I'm going to ask a question specifically to one of our panelists. And then after that person answers, then if anybody else wants to jump in, please feel free to do so. Because as you can tell, this is a rich, smart group of folk who have who have a lot to contribute to help us understand what we're up against and how we fight. So my first question will be to Mr. McWhorter, to share his story about what you have dealt with in terms of having your vote challenged. Because signed into law after the 2020 election was SB 202. And then recently we've had SB 189, which has increased hurdles to getting registered to vote and staying registered. These anti-voter laws have undermined the administration of Georgia elections by eliminating ballot boxes, imposing harmful deadlines for election certification, and opening up new and unfounded scrutiny of our elections. Can I just say suitcases of ballots? So you know what I'm talking about. If the Voting Rights Act had been restored to full strength by Congress, Georgia's anti-voter laws would have gone through pre-clearance, which means that anything that they were trying to propose to do would have to be cleared first by the U.S. Department of Justice or by the federal courts in D.C. before it could get implemented, before its discriminatory impacts could happen. That was the power of the Voting Rights Act. That was the power of pre-clearance. And it's likely that Georgia's anti-voter laws would not have been allowed to take effect. But without the Voting Rights Act, Georgia's anti-voter laws have paved the way for election deniers, inspired by Trump's 2020 election lies, to challenge an unlimited number of their neighbors' voter registrations. Mr. McWhorter, can you share your experience with Georgia's anti-voter laws? And specifically, can you describe the moment you received the letter challenging your freedom to vote? How did that affect you personally?
Yes, ma'am. Once again, thanks for having me. The effect of that on me when I received that initial letter, I was taken aback greatly of my right to vote to be challenged. The reason why it was challenged, that's neither here nor there, but it was challenged. So I was going to work. I said, let me stop by and see Miss Smith at Suite 300. But I actually fell into a war, so to speak. And I'm glad I did, because I was one of the only few residents of DeKalb County that would show up. I sat in the back of the room and everybody started turning around. The commissioner said, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't ask, was anybody here, because nobody comes to represent themselves. So I just told my story. It's long in the story, but it's my story. But for anyone to challenge that, they have the right by the laws of the state of Georgia. And once again, I always quote a movie, Jurassic Park, the lines of Jeff Goldblum. It's not if you could, it's if you should. Yes. So I walked in, I spoke for myself, and here I am today. And I find out that this is going on all over the country. And whatever soapbox I have to inform our voters, to check for your status, please do. And it has affected me positively to push out there this information, and it affected me negatively that it hurt me. So that's how I was taken aback.
Thank you. And this is the law that allows an individual to challenge an unlimited number of voters' eligibility. And that also then requires that Board of Elections to, within a shortened amount of time, to respond very quickly, which means that the person has just a very shortened amount of time to respond. And so imagine if you're just having your regular everyday life, and we know what our everyday lives look like, with childcare, with work, with trying to get to the grocery store, with everything, with all the errands that we're running. And then this notice comes through saying.
And that was the thing about it. Mm-hmm. You only had a day or two from the board to get you the information for you to take off work to get there. And if you don't make it, it was just a day. And it was on my way to my job. I just happened to stop by. And that's the key. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that took me aback. The amount of time you had to respond. You hit the nail on the head.
Well, one of the things about these challenges, unlimited challenges, is that they're using data that is not accurate. And so people that are legitimately eligible to vote are being challenged in terms of their ability to vote. And like you said, they're putting you into this burdensome category of being able to respond quickly, which you don't have if you're working. Gwinnett County, you're here from Gwinnett County. They had 37,000 people at one time that was challenged by one person. And of course, it was denied, thankfully, but it was challenged using data that is outdated. And SB 189 even made it more easier for people to challenge and use certain criteria that is not legitimate criteria to be used. There has always been a process for removing people that shouldn't be on the rolls. So this is just another process, another burden that people had to overcome through this challenge process.
May I say something about Gwinnett County? So I, along with 7 other people, regularly attend the Board of Registration and Elections meetings held once a month, and we get a chance to do public comments. We also observe what's happening. Of the hundreds of thousands of challenges that have occurred in the last 2 years since I've been attending, fewer than 5 people show up to defend. So that goes to what Brother McWhorter was talking about. Fewer than 5 people show up to attend, and they know that. Along with the crazy types of evidence that they try to present, and cute little stories about people.
I'll probably be the nerdy one and kind of reflect on how the implementation of these things takes place for county departments of elections. There is an ongoing process. I think Fulton County has 14, 15, 16 full-time people who every single day do address changes. They do deceased voters. They get felon notices from the courts. There's a dashboard that comes to us from all kinds of different sources that we have to address. And the Board of Elections can know at every meeting, are we how caught up are we? Are we far behind? We've implemented in Fulton County lots of different changes to make our list even better. But what happens when somebody dumps 10,000 names into your department, all work on stuff we know is real comes to a halt because we have 10 days from the time we receive that information to notify people like Mr. McWhorter, to set a date, to begin the process of notifying people. And that's immutable, that's in law. So it jumps ahead of the work that we know we have to do and that we need to do, and that actually improves our list versus lists that come from God knows where, oftentimes duplicates, oftentimes just incorrect, or people who've already been taken off, but somehow they're bringing them back to us. And so it's incredibly frustrating, not to mention it is, for a county like Fulton, it is very expensive.
Thank you so much for that. Because one of the things to me is that sometimes these laws have the tendency to look really innocuous or to look really sanitized, but to see how they're really implemented and how they're targeted. So when Gwinnett County, which is the most diverse county in Georgia, gets 37,000 challenges in one hit, it begins to tell you that this is a targeted hit, that this isn't some random, oh, we think we've got a few folk out there. There are people that are targeted on these lists that they want to remove from the rolls, that they want to make sure don't have access to the ballot box. And this is really part of the major implications of not having a viable Voting Rights Act in place right now. So I want to move to our next question. And it's important to keep the 2020 election in mind for context when discussing these voter challenges. President Biden won the 2020 election by 11,779 votes. And we all remember that infamous phone call to Georgia's Secretary of State from Donald Trump. I just need you to find me 11,780 votes. 11,780. I just need you to find that one extra vote that will allow me to walk off with Georgia's 16 electoral college votes. That's what that was about. And it wasn't about finding real votes. It was about manufacturing the votes. And so because the margins are so thin, in terms of what the Electoral College means. That is exactly what these hits on voter challenges, voters' eligibility is really all about. And so there's no doubt, now we're looking forward, there's no doubt that the 2024 election will be close. With these new anti-voter laws in effect, one that Governor Brian Kemp has said he signed into law because he was frustrated with the results of the 2020 election. Could these anti-voter laws have an impact on the election or the perception of Georgia's voting process? Kathy.
Well, I think so. I think the things that worry me the most, and the state election board's meeting yesterday and today, and God only knows how much longer, but the constant changing of rules on how we actually execute elections, frankly, by people who know very little about election. They use big words, but when you sort of kind of get into like how this actually works, they're frequently not right. Also, just the sense that, there's a tremendous hurry to get that done, and we're just about 30 days from voting starting. But what's of absolute most concern to me, because it's been playing out in Fulton County, is this issue of the definition of certification, what that actually means, and sort of how that plays out. And there was a rule today or yesterday that was passed that said, election board members like me previously should be able to access anything that's a reasonable request. What's hidden in that reasonable request is, when do you get that, and can you remove it from the building prior to certification? And what really I believe people want to do, because they've asked to do it, is get critical kind of base election materials so they can take it home and share it with their friends and start whatever narrative they want to do before we certify, which then makes it very difficult to sort of get to the end of this process without a lot of interference. It's important for people to know there are checks and balances and checks and balances and many, many steps along the way to challenge an election that appears to be improperly done or miscounted or mistakes were made. But once you start interrupting that and, kind of coming up with your own new rules, it gets to be very scary, and I'm quite worried about that.
I agree. I think that the denying or being able to deny certification of the election is very critical. In fact, it may put us back into the court system, as we did in 2000 with the Bush v. Gore. If the elections are not certified, having the courts to certify, you create enough a disruption around the process. Having the courts to then certify gets us into bad territory as well, because if you look at how the courts are stacked, again, and the decisions that have been coming from the Supreme Court really puts us in a bad light. So to me, all of these barriers that have been put in place, we've got to educate the voters about them. We've got to be at all of these board meetings to make sure we're expressing what we want done, how we feel they're done. And like you said, the Board of Elections have the opportunity to review any piece or any part of the process of the voting while it's in place, so that at the end of the voting process, during the tabulation, there is no need to look at paperwork that just burdens people down from doing what they normally do, because you should have been there and doing that all along to look at the paperwork. You're there to see what the process is, and there is no other reason for it other than just say, I want to stop this process if I don't like the outcome. But that is not what election certification is all about.
Yes, you may.
To piggyback on the words of these wonderful women here, I think back to Jan 6, so people will say. Certification. When an individual wants to stop a certification or send fake electors to deter a certification, this is what they're talking about. This is what it jars my memory. That's the adjective fails me, but that's that. You should feel it as a human being for someone to take a narrative and to flip it. So certifications, false certifications is a problem. So those laws that can implement that to happen is beyond my recognition or my recollection.
The run up to January 6th. And when you think about it, you had Newt Gingrich talking about they stole the election in Atlanta. They stole the election in Philadelphia. They stole the election in Detroit. They stole the election in Milwaukee. Notice he didn't say they stole the election in Salt Lake City. So it is identifying cities that have sizable Black populations. And then when they went after Maricopa County, a county that has a sizable Latino and indigenous population. So it is really about identifying it is racializing the theft of American democracy and then justifying the violence that seems okay to get American democracy back in the hands of the people where it should be in this narrative. So, Mr. McWhorter, when you're talking about not having the words are racism. Yeah, that's the word. And we have dealt with this in our history. We have dealt with massive disfranchisement in Mississippi. I start off my book in Mississippi in 1890. When they had the Mississippi Plan, which was to figure out how to get rid of all of these Black folks from the voting rolls, because you had more African-American men registered to vote than you had white men registered to vote. And so they started hollering voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud.
Since you mentioned Mississippi, let me just say between 1892 and 1977, all four of my grandparents were born, lived, worked, and died in Mississippi. One of them was the son of a previously enslaved person. All of them, the others, were grandchildren of previously enslaved people. My grandfather and I even were born in Amite County, Mississippi, which is, if you remember the name of Lewis Allen, and what's his name? Herbert Lee. Herbert Lee in 1961, Lewis Allen witnessed his murder by a state representative. This was also the location where SNCC and Robert Moses, Bob Moses, the legend of the civil rights movement, actually were working to register people to vote in my home county, okay? Yes, that too. And what happened is, not only that, members of my family that I learned about recently, a brother of one of my family members, or a brother, his young wife and her baby, and their parents were murdered because they had worked for Lewis Allen and because they were doing work for Lewis Allen. They were murdered, killed, burned in their home. And this takes you back to 1875 election, when in 1875, white Democrats in Mississippi did these Democratic clubs where they were doing guns, knives, and intimidating people because they were determined to win the 1875 election. The testimony about this was done by the Republican Senate in 1876. I'm going to stop there. But this is a long history of suppression. And you talk about bureaucratic violence. Now it has shifted to that, where people think that they're smart, but they're actually quite weird in their understanding of the law and of the republic. So.
And one of the powers of knowing this history is knowing how the parties flipped. So when you're talking about the Democrats of 1875, part of what we're seeing is then as the issue of civil rights became a national issue with the Great Migration, because now you had Black folks going up to Pennsylvania and to Illinois. And then those Northern politicians had to pay attention to the issue of civil rights. And so you started seeing the issue flip. So in 48, you had a split in the Democratic Party where you had President Truman going, okay, we got to have some civil rights. And you had the Dixiecrats with Strom Thurmond going, oh no, peace out, we're out of here, we're not doing this. So that was the beginning of the first fissure. And then you had another one in 52 with Eisenhower, because Eisenhower did not want the Brown decision. Eisenhower was a Republican and he hated the Brown decision that was coming down. And so you saw a piece of the solid Democratic South break off and go for Eisenhower in that 52 election. And then in 64, where Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee, voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you had Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act as well as the Voting Rights Act in 65. That's where you see this massive shift. And so the Democratic Party became a party that was about civil rights, and the Republican Party was doubling down on what they called the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy was to woo in these disaffected whites who hated civil rights, to woo them into the Republican Party. And that toxin, they thought they could control it, but that toxin took over the Republican Party, and that's what we're seeing right now. So I want to keep on with another question in the line that we're talking about here. Voter and election worker intimidation is still happening. In 1981, the Republican Party mobilized 200 volunteers who, carrying firearms, intimidated and chased Black and brown voters away from the polls in New Jersey's governor's race, helping their candidate win. It ended in a lawsuit that required the National Republican Party to abstain from poll watching without court approval. But in 2017, the GOP was freed from that agreement. Many election workers are now facing threats and intimidation. The Douglas County Elections Director here in Georgia is facing threats, which are often made with racial slurs. He uses his office's back exit and alternate routes home in order to protect himself. Yes, this is in 2024. And we remember the death threats that Trump allies inspired against Georgia election workers Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss after the 2020 election. Now, the Republican Party has pledged to deploy 100,000 poll watchers in November. The state election board is also considering a new rule to allow more poll watchers to engage here. Mr. Porter, what can be done to safeguard voters and election workers from intimidation and threats of violence?
First, there are many things that can be done. One thing that surely has to be done, and I, along with 7 others, are attendees Board of Registration and Election meetings, and we stand in opposition to the craziness, because it is important to do that, because they stand there and they threaten the board members with accusations about criminal acts and charges against them. So we have to stand and call a spade, or these people out on what they are attempting to do. And this shows you what the ignorance and denial of history does. Because they'll stand there and say, well, you know, it was Democrats who did all of that in the South. And I stood there and I looked at them. Those Democrats are your ancestors. You inherited everything that you're doing right now from them. So don't come here trying to be smart and reveal your ignorance. We have to stand, and we stand against that kind of stuff. But furthermore, we have to be engaged doing the poll watching, recruiting people to do poll watching, encouraging people to vote, encouraging young people to vote. Those are the kinds of things that we must do. They have cadres of 100,000 here to do poll watching, and they are going to do some stuff that is actually illegal, and any human being should not be doing to another to threat and to intimidate. We have to call them out on that. I, in fact, have called some people out when I was doing poll watching, particularly during the recount. You have to call them out. So you have to do that and join other people who are engaged in an effort to get people to register. Well, it's too late now for this election coming up. But to ensure, that's the other thing, is that if you know you're registered, check your registration to make sure that there's not some issue with that. But those are, there's a myriad of things that can be done and we should do. And we should always stand in opposition where people are making public speeches that is insane or is without history.
Ms. Moderator? If there's anyone else that has a statement about that, I would like to be the caboose behind that. So is there anyone else?
Well, I could say that we have our own poll, not watchers, because those are normally appointed by the political parties, and we're nonprofit, nonpartisan, so we have what we call poll monitors that we assign to different polling locations that have experienced problems or where we anticipate problems to be. So we ask people to join us. We train you to do that work. We go in every county. We want people to be a part of that, be our poll monitors, where we're there to assist voters. Our monitors can actually assist voters that require assistance. If they are asked to do so, they can go in with them and ensure that their vote is counted. But they're there on the outside to make sure there's no problems. They're there to make sure the poll locations are set up correctly, that they have the correct number of polling equipment that is there. But I mean, there are some things that have been changed in the law that says that the election officials can change the number of machines that are available after advanced voting is there for election day. So I'm typically in our locations where people of color tend to be assigned, they usually have problems and long lines because they don't have enough working equipment for them to cast their votes. Therefore, we're saying vote early. As the congressperson said, Congressman Johnson said, vote early. That's the number one thing, to make sure if there are problems, you can get them corrected. But join us as our poll monitors. And then our poll monitors change from being at the polling locations to actually do the observation on the counting, the actual tabulation process for absentee ballot counting, for the actual tabulation on election day. And then we're after that for the actual process where provisional ballots are cured. They actually follow up to make sure those are done. We also follow up before absentee voting to look at what problems with absentee ballots have been rejected. Can we then get those cured? So be a part of that process. We have a toll-free hotline that if you encounter any problem with voting, call 866-OUR-VOTE. That's 866-687-8683. We want to make sure that your vote, it does count and that you're not turned away.
Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of nitty gritty. In Fulton County, for a normal election day, we have 250 polling places. We utilize about 3,000 volunteers. All political. We don't ask people their political party. If you want to volunteer, you go through training, you want to follow the rules, you are welcome and encouraged to come and work with us. But one of the things that we're seeing is that we have poll watchers in particular who decide they know the rules better, or they decide they don't like what's going on. And so then they become a problem. What people really need to understand is the poll manager is the ultimate decider. At that moment, if that person is uncomfortable with what somebody's doing, they can have somebody leave. And the time to fix that is long after the election. If you feel like you weren't treated right, If you feel like you didn't get to stand where you wanted to stand and somebody finally asked you to leave because you complained too loudly, that's the right of the poll manager. Good, bad, or indifferent. They might be wrong, but you don't get to settle it that day. Because what we're trying to ensure is the safety and security and peace and quiet of people who want to come in and cast their vote. They don't need to see the attitude. They don't need to see that you think you're smarter than everybody in the room. And we have a lot of that problem in Fulton County. We have some people that are continuing to litigate 2020 in Fulton County who frankly got fired as, poll workers because they didn't do their job right. And so we're still having to deal with them. And so on to just the specifics of the security, I think every county has a very serious security plan with their police department, off-duty police officers, off-duty. Fulton County does. I believe we have somebody at every single polling place now. It's quite expensive. Didn't used to have to be. Used to we could have people in the region and circulate around if there was a problem, but now we have to have people there all the time.
I think we also have to be cognizant, though, that those police officers can't interfere with the voting process because we don't want them to intimidate voters. We don't want them setting up roadblocks outside of the polling location because that deters people from voting. So that's why we have to be vigilant. That's why we have our poll monitors to make sure that those things aren't happening. But like you said, poll watchers are inside the polling location. They're deemed to be there. The poll manager is the ultimate choice of whether they stay inside. Likewise, our poll monitors can go inside with the request of a voter. But of course, if our people are acting up to, they have to go outside as well. Though our people don't do that. They're there to assist the voter and ensure that they get to cast their legitimate vote. But I agree with you. Just want to clarify that how it works, the system works, because some people think poll watchers, they can say something in the polling locations. Quite honestly, they're not supposed to do anything but observe, and they can't communicate with the voters. They can only be in a specific location that's assigned by the poll manager. So we have to make sure people understand what their rights are and that they not try to take over the administration of the election when they don't have that responsibility.
Thank you. And I just want to add, okay, I know, Mr. Caboose, I got it. The last day to register to vote is October 7th. I just wanted to add that clarification.
To push everything along what these three individuals have said, there was a word that was thrown out by each one of them. It's called intimidation. What that does, it instills fear. And when a person or individual has fear, they become reluctant to vote. Someone once said, everything we want in our life is on the other side of fear. And if an individual wants to intimidate you, they want to instill fear. So what we have to do is be vigilant in our actions for someone that don't want to go to the polls because they're intimidated and they're instilled with fear. If we got to hold hands and walk them along, that's what has to vigilance to overcome the intimidation. Now, when somebody intimidates someone, there's an underlying mechanism behind it. It's for their agenda. And when you step past that fear, the world opens up to you. And when you step past that fear to vote, the world opens up to you. Now, no matter what religion, race, party agenda, or creed you have, you should be able to express that your feelings or your thoughts or your ideals. That is the beauty of democracy. But for someone to intimidate you, to not want to do that, that's what we have to eliminate. So you hear all on social media, the AR-15s walking out, like we was talking about, the poll watchers and stuff, stand back and all that stuff like that. That's to instill fear.
And fear was one of the key elements in the civil rights struggle. I remember them talking about Mississippi dealt fear. And we came back in Freedom Summer we said, no, thanks. And it's that kind of resolve, that kind of resilience. And so I want to move to another question. Throughout America's history, and Georgia specifically, voter suppression has evolved from tactics like voter intimidation, poll taxes, and literacy tests to more sophisticated strategies like limiting hours of local elections offices, reducing the number of polling locations, purging voters from the rolls, and more. Jim Crow has evolved. We call him Jim Crow Esquire now. Shifting from predominantly physical intimidation and violence to bureaucratic violence, where officials use administrative authority to change rules and alter circumstances with the goal of limiting access to the ballot box. We're witnessing this right now with the Georgia State Election Board. They're working to change our election rules with less than 100 days to go. These MAGA-aligned members are trying to pass new rules that can be used to sow distrust in election outcomes and delay or stop the certification of election results. The last-minute rules changes are being put forward and supported by Republican Party operatives and election deniers. If the Voting Rights Act was in full force, the state election board's proposed rule changes may have required federal government review before putting into effect. Kathy, can you speak more about these changes that the state election board is pushing through and what they could mean for 2024? And for our other panelists hearing all of this, what's your reaction? And so what's your message to Georgia voters? So,
Well, the state election board has been meeting again yesterday, today. They may go on next week, and they're moving forward with, I don't know, probably 24 new rules. They'll be in various stages of development. In my watching the state election board over the last several years, I don't even remember them doing a rule. So the fact that they're doing this many rules in such a short period of time, and specifically changing rules almost less than a month before early voting starts, is truly scary. And you have people who say they're experts, but they aren't experts. They're passionate advocates for their own side who think they have some story to tell and some recommendation. And we had a long discussion, for example, today on, what kind of memory cards we should buy and where we should buy them and what the specs were and why the other ones weren't any good. I mean, this is truly troubling because it seems like an innocuous thing, but as people getting deeply into the business of what county election boards do and the evisceration of the Secretary of State's office has created some of this room for the state election board to think that they're actually in charge of elections. And they are not in charge of elections, but they think that they are. And I have been horrified for the last several months to watch them, for example, I think retry Fulton County at least 3 times this summer, and then continue to reinterpret the guidelines that they had as they were doing it. They're not going to be successful in this for a variety of reasons. Well, for the reasons I just stated. But that's not the rule of law. That's not how we behave in this country. And election boards should be slow, methodical, nonpartisan. That's certainly the way I tried to run my shop. You don't take up 20 things in one meeting, and they're very disparate amendments to very specific kinds of things. And both the General Assembly and the State Election Board pay very little attention to election administrators, to the people who actually do elections, to say, hey, I can't get this done in an hour and a half in Fulton County because we've got 20 miles of highway to run down before we can get everything in the door. So I can't even summarize the craziness that has gone on in the last 2 days because it's kind of not finished, and there will be court battles and there will be county offices that aren't real sure what they're supposed to do because they're not sure where in the process these crazy rules are. But I would encourage anyone to take the time to watch them because you don't need to know about elections to know what's going on is wrong.
I will say this from what it says to me is that it's critical that you elect the right people. Number one, you need to look at who's on the ballot and see what they've been voting for. Because the state legislature did all of these changes to satisfy nothing. There was no fraud. There was no, there was nothing. There are normal errors that you make, but from the most part, there was no widespread fraud that would change the outcome of any election. So we need to make sure that the people we're putting in office are the right people. We need to look at their records, see what they're voting on, see what they've done to put in place. They've taken the power of the Secretary of State away in SB 202. They have a takeover of the boards of election in SB 202. I was on a board of election and I was removed because I wanted easier access. Again, they're doing these things not because they're problems, but because this is a way to deter people from voting. But if we show up in mass numbers, we can change the outcome of any election cycle. I'm telling you, if you look at the 2020 election for Black people alone, that not just the people of color, there were almost 1 million Black people who were registered to vote but didn't show up to vote. Think if that number shows up, what could happen? There couldn't be any question of finding 11,780 votes. So we've got to make sure we're engaged in this process, that we elect the right people that are going to do the right thing and put the right policies in place, and the right policies, I mean the right laws in place. So we need to make sure that we're getting the right people elected. And we've got to make sure the voting public knows that despite these barriers that they put in place, there's always a workaround. It's just like they changed the absentee voting process so that only, certain people can do it now for application, not for the ballot itself, but for an application. ID, all of this requiring an ID for the absentee ballot application. Well, we get around that. We put up a copying machine so people can make a copy of their ID that is required to go with that absentee ballot. So there are ways to work around these things that people are talking about. We don't want you to be deterred, but we're educating you on what is there. But there are people here to help you. Fair Fight, People's Agenda, so many other organizations that are out here to help you, that you don't have to be afraid to vote. We will teach you how to vote. Your local boards of election can show the machine to you. If you don't know how it works, a lot of people don't want to show up because I haven't used this thing and I don't know what it does. They can show you the process. They have a lot of material to tell you how to do it. Request that in your community. Don't just sit by. Make sure you're educated on that process. But the more you show up and vote, you do not have to worry about any barrier that's out there. There'll be people to help you overcome those barriers.
Yes. And so I want to do the last question because we're running on time right now. Earlier, I mentioned voter suppression, how voter suppression has evolved over the years. And I'm sure all of you have seen this evolution throughout your lives. We've also seen some monumental changes that have improved and protected voter access. But with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by federal court rulings, things have taken a trend for the worse. And we are thankful, Lord, yes, for leaders like Senators Warnock and Ossoff for introducing legislation in Congress that would update and restore critical safeguards of the original Voting Rights Act. And that would be the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And there's also the Freedom to Vote Act. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act deals with updating the criteria for pre-clearance, the thing that led John Roberts, as he wrote the opinion for Shelby County v. Holder, to say, oh, this is old stuff, that is old stuff, we don't do that anymore. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would update that to put it to current conditions. And the Freedom to Vote Act would deal with things like same-day voter registration. Wow. What would restoring the Voting Rights Act mean for Georgia and for America as a whole? And so I'm asking each one of you.
Well, to me, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would restore, as you said, the pre-clearance part of the process. And that meant that Georgia wouldn't have put in place these things like polling location changes or closing and consolidating. It wouldn't have been able to put these laws into place without getting pre-approval if you have the right Justice Department. Again, we have to go through the right Justice Department. The other thing is the Freedom to Vote Act has standards that would be for all elections, and though that is critical. Also, they have a Native American Voting Rights Act too that should be put in place. And I also want to always throw in DC statehood should be a part of this as well, because that gives a little more representation of people that don't have that representation right now. So to me, it's critical that we do that. But in the interim, while we don't have it, again, it's critical we elect the right people that are going to put in place laws that will protect our right to vote. And that's what it's all about. We had Ms. Nugent run for Secretary of State. It's people like that that will put in place the laws that will protect that right to vote. So we got to make sure we do that.
Thank you.
I don't really know that I have anything to add, but I think the pre-clearance piece is really so critical, because again, what we're seeing is just sort of a collapsing of sort of time and thoughtfulness about changes that get made, and there's this rush now to do as many changes as they can possibly do until somebody manages to stop them. I think having pre-clearance would really put some guardrails into what's changing and how those debates go.
I often speak to the people who are assembled in front of the Board of Registration and Elections, and I say to them that you're my distant cousins, because in fact they are. Many of them are my distant cousins, fair, all that kind of stuff. And I say, I can testify, I actually refer back to St. Paul in his letter to the Romans. I can testify about my friends in opposition. They have a zeal for God and our republic, but not according to knowledge. And my heart's desire and prayer to God is that they may be saved from their covetous, blind pursuit of power. They're intent on choosing an electorate of their own design to maintain their power. So I stand in opposition to those people who are pining for Caesar's republic. They keep saying we don't know the difference between a democracy and a republic. They're pining for Caesar's republic. So I say, as Cassius says in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, because they're going after a man who is criminally infantile and want to hand over our republic to him. But I say, as Cassius says in Shakespeare's Caesar, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. Friends, I choose not to be an underling. They say they like Caesar's policies. They haven't read their Project 2025. We need to do that. We need to educate them. We need to educate ourselves. We got to move on.
Mr. Moderator, in brevity, I would say that right there, all that. I would say all that. But what it would mean to me is, what it means to me is every individual that is a legal citizen of the United States of America, whatever state, county, borough, city, municipality that you're in, that you can go do this one thing. Hey, I just want to I feel this way about this person and this policy. That's what it means to me. No more, no less, just to have every individual that can do it. I'm here. That's all.
And what we know is that there are these states, we've got this really weird thing happening in the United States. There are these states that really take the right to vote very seriously. And they are figuring out ways how to open up access to the ballot box. And what you're seeing is that their voter turnout rate is skyrocketing. So that is the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, that same day voter registration. That is figuring out how do we do this. And then there are states that are figuring out how do we clamp down? How do we shut down access to the ballot box? How do we create additional hurdles? And so you have, depending upon where you live, your access to the right to vote is fundamentally different. And the Voting Rights Act basically levels that playing field. The Voting Rights Act treats you as an American citizen with the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act puts the behemoth of the federal government behind that right to vote. And what we saw in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was signed, that fewer than 6% of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote in 1965. By 1967, it was almost 60%. That is the power of the Voting Rights Act. And it's that power that is so frightening to those people who are so afraid of a vibrant, multiracial, multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic democracy. And that's the democracy we must have if we are to survive as a nation.
You guys did very much great job of laying out the issues at play. My question for you, in light of the recent state board of election changes and news that are going on this week, I want you to, if you could, spell out for voters, how will the new state board of election rules passed this week affect Fulton County voters this fall election season specifically?
Well, a little bit remains to be seen because a lot of them were sort of approved for approval in 30 days. The vast majority of them probably. The two that kind of really impact our operations are the one that Julie Adams filed, which listed out the things that they could have access to, which they already had access to. Then she filed a lawsuit after we gave her access to them, but I can't talk too much about that. And then this issue of what a reasonable inquiry is. And I think that is going to be a tremendously challenging policy change because 159 counties now are going to have to arm wrestle over what's a reasonable inquiry. And I think, again, the aim of that is to be able to remove things from the building prior to certification. I know that sounds really wonky and weird, but to have people take stuff out and start a narrative before the process is over is just absolutely beyond the pale. It makes me incredibly nervous for the fall.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I think she said it all. I mean, the rules that they're putting in place puts a lot of undue burden on the election officials who oppose a lot of the actions. And the counties don't have the budgets to take care of the things that they're proposing, even though they say they've allotted money for that, appropriated money for that. We'll see if that happens. But these are just things that are put in place for for the sake of minor number of people is not for the masses of people.
And let me just give you an example. So, so what if the state election board says you should use this machine, this scanner, this memory card, and the Secretary of State's office says, no, you should use that one. Who do we listen to? And how fast do we get that conflict resolved? Because these folks think that they have unlimited authority to do virtually anything. They don't seem to understand the difference between their role, the General Assembly's role, and the Secretary of State's role. And unfortunately, it's left to 159 counties to try to anticipate where they're going with this and then understand how to implement it. And I could kind of go on and on about examples about that, but I think that that's sort of what it comes down to.
How are they able to even, what is the legal authority for this state election board coming so close to the fall election? For you to be able to do this in light of, and some people have raised questions about, with the governor and the Secretary of State in 2020 being the firewall, for lack of a better word, to the election deniers being able to change the results. Now it seems as though the state election board is superseding the authority of the Secretary of State, or is that his office in cahoots with this? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not under the impression that he's in cahoots with this in any way. I could offer my own criticisms of that, but I think what we're going to see is an awful lot of litigation. I think every one of these rules is going to be met with multiple lawsuits. I think keeping that sort of whiteboard of what's happening, where, and when is going to be very challenging for anybody to do, and certainly shouldn't be the role of election administrators. Election administrators have a very clear cut, again, it ought to be boring. It ought to be step 1, step 2, step 3. And now what we've got is like little dangly pieces on those steps that, may or may not make sense to the processes that are in place. And I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of litigation all the way through this election. And they're setting the stage for litigation at the tail end to be incredibly meaningful.
So we're going to have questions after Congresswoman Nikema Williams gives us some comments, some closing remarks.
Well, hello, everybody.
Hi. I'm not shorter than you.
Hello, everybody. I am Congresswoman Nikema Williams, and I proudly represent Georgia's fighting 5th Congressional District. I came in on the tail end of this conversation, and it gets me fired up every time I hear, especially you, Dr. Anderson, because I know that you've been in the trenches with Miss Helen. We've been doing this work for a long time. But y'all, I serve in the United States Congress, and I'm in the seat that was held by the late Congressman John Lewis. And we know that we are here because it is the 59th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And we should not still be fighting for the same freedoms that Mr. Lewis gave a little blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge for. But I am so grateful that I have people that are willing to still do the work, regardless of it being the year 2024, but yet we are still having to fight for these freedoms. What I know is that in the United States Congress, we've introduced the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and we passed it not once, not twice, but 3 times in our democratically controlled House. But we did not get Republicans who were willing to stand with us. And that is what we're seeing happening right here in our state. If you go right down the street, it is where did Mr. McCordick, there he is. It pains me what you had to go through. And I've been having this conversation year after year, and people thought that it was hyperbole, that we were just saying that the sky is falling, that SB 202, well, they're just calling it Jim Crow 2.0. Call it what you want to call it, but they're still seeking the same results, and that is to restrict people's access to the ballot. So that is why we know that we have choices on the ballot. I'm looking at the shirt that says, when we fight, we win. And Lauren, that is right. When we fight, we win. But when we vote, we win. We know that when we show up to the polls and we use our voices at the ballot box, we have power, y'all. And that is why these rules have changed. We played by the rules in 2020. We had people on our Board of Elections doing this work, 159 counties, Kathy, and 159 ways to do this. But then the rules changed. The rules changed because when we played by their rules, we won. But we can do it again, y'all. We shouldn't have to out-organize our way out of voter suppression. But I am so grateful for partners like we have here at this table and at Fair Fight who are still willing to do the work regardless of the rules that have been put in front of us. So I am here to let you know that as the person who is holding up the legacy of the late Congressman John Lewis every day, I want to leave you with words that Mr. Lewis left us with in his final op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He said, the fight for our democracy is not the fight for a day, a month, or a year. It is the fight and the struggle of a lifetime. And so we know that we have to continue to do this work over and over because there are forces working against us, y'all. But there are so many other forces working to protect our freedoms, to protect our freedom to vote. And that's where we come in. The people will have the last say because when we vote, y'all, we win.
Incredible panel.
I have a question for Mr. McWhorter. Sir, would you mind telling us a little bit more about the text of the challenge and registration and why they were wrong?
Okay,
We want you to be heard.
the whole thing started when I used my business address to get an ID to function in society, which is not against the law because a lot of people live inside their business. And an individual challenged that, and I happened to get the letter and go in and speak for myself and let them know why I did what I did, because they said if you are a homeless individual, you can take a map of where you're displaced at and draw a circle and register. But the oxymoron is you can register to vote with that. That's the law. But you cannot vote without a valid ID. So I was having mail come to my business, and I did it for a number of years because I'd rather have my mail, my packages and stuff come to a place where I spent 10 to 12 hours a day at my barbershop. So that was challenged, and I just went and spoke upon that situation, and it was resolved. But the lie that was told, it cannot be done. But the law says you can use a business address to register to vote and to take it to the ballot box and show your ID. So that's how my plight got into this. Now with these experts here, I don't know how I got into it, but no, it's something that I was educated to that I didn't know. Ignorance of the law is on your own behalf. But since that happened, man, sir, thanks for asking me that question. People that I've come in contact with, I've just been expressing this and expressing that about voter registration. Because there's the way I could have went to the DMV with a map with a circle on it to get an ID. And there's no way I could have went to the poll with a map. So that's my plight. Thanks for asking.
Mr. McWhorter, you and I talked
Yes, sir.
so we know your situation, obviously, before moving on the house. What are your plans like to vote this next cycle? Do you think you're gonna vote early? You're gonna vote the day of? Looking at the absentee? What are your plans for the lobby?
You really want to know that? I'm going the day of. it's going to be like a Black Friday for me. You know, I want to be there in line, you know, when the doors open up and when I get the sales and stuff. So yeah, the day of, to answer your question, is the feeling, that blissfulness that I get a chance to do this. Hey, this is how I feel. Oh, congratulations. You know, but yeah, the day of, no matter where I'm at on this God's given earth, I'm gonna be right back here in Stone Mountain, Georgia, zip code 383 at Stone Mill Elementary. And I'm gonna get that card. I'm gonna stick it in. Yeah, that's the feeling for me. And like I said, it's gonna make me. It's blissful right now. It's blissful. Thanks for asking.
Advice we have, we are Black Liberties Nonprofit. Your advice to folks to ensure that their vote counted. I heard you say earlier, vote early, check your registration often, consider being volunteering to the poll monitor. Any other advice that you give to folks to ensure that their vote is counted?
Take people to the polls. We have a Ride to the Poll program. We have an app as well as a website. RideToThePoll.com. So you can sign up anywhere in the state, request a ride. You can also volunteer to be a driver to take people to the polls. The idea is to get everybody there, but also we want people to be educated. I think he talked about Project 2025. We want people to be educated about the ballot. We need people to get a sample ballot. Vote it at home, your sample ballot, take it in with you. You can take that sample ballot with you so you don't have to stand there and read the question. You just check off what you have already. That's a way to do it for a lot of people. But we want people to show up and vote. I'm saying vote early. Absentee ballot, don't use that process because the postal system won't get it there till 6 weeks after the election is over.
You can't do drop boxes though, right?
Drop boxes, technically you can do drop boxes technically, but there's a rule that's being promulgated right now that drop boxes, if you take it in, you're going to have to produce your ID to use the drop box, which negates the process of doing a drop box. They want you to, if you give your, like there are certain people, your immediate family member, your caregiver, and if someone is illiterate or disabled, I could take their ballot in for them. But that would require me to show my ID. If I don't have my ID, then their ballots then become a provisional ballot that voter has to come back and do something. So we have to understand the rules and work around the rules. So to me, absentee voting is out right now till we correct that process. So early voting is the process. Drop boxes are basically non-extinct. They're extinct in my opinion. They require now a camera surveillance and all of that. And so it's just something that is not workable for now. But there are some people that are disabled, and if where we can, for people that can do that for them, take it in for them. Remember to take your ID so their ballot doesn't have to be put in a provisional status. So it's that kind of thing. We just have to educate people how to work around it. But for the majority of us, we can go vote early, which is about 17 days prior to election. And if there's a problem, you can go back and cure it within that time period. So that's what I'm advocating for. Know who's on the ballot. Know what they stand for. Know their record, please. Don't just go like, oh, I've seen that person on TV. Just because that person's been on TV may not be the right person. So you need to know what they stand for, what they are doing. Have them come to your neighborhood to talk to your neighborhood. We're doing a block by block campaign where we're asking people in the neighborhood to get your people registered, get them educated, we'll give them the materials to provide, have them tell you what their plan is to go vote, whether they'll need a ride, and we set them up for a ride. If we don't have people to take them, we're doing Lyft and Uber codes. So there's no excuse. We want people to show up and vote. If you have a church van, you want to donate the church van so we can take them, especially the ones that have mobility capability. So those are the kinds of things that we can do to get people to show up to vote at the polls.
I just want to add one thing that people can do today is go to the Secretary of State's website and check my voter page and check your voter registration. Make sure everything is in order. Look at the address that's on there and make sure that's the address that's on your ID. Just make sure everything is in order and that you know your polling place if you're going to vote on election day. And to Ms. Helen's point, make a plan today. Decide what day you're going to vote, what time of day you're going to vote. If you like voting on election day, absolutely vote on election day. But if your schedule is a little bit crazy and you never really know day to day, if you got to pick the kids up in traffic, consider voting. Yeah, you might get sick there. Consider going early. I know what day I'm voting because I'm going to be out of town a good bit. And I think that's important. But please, please, please go to my voter page. Make sure that your voter registration is ordered now, because you'll have plenty of time to correct it with your county registration office.
One thing I'd like to say is that, well, we know that people in my age group and older tend to vote, have a higher, no, it's not so much, have a higher participation rate in the voting process. I'll be 72 in December. Okay.
72.
Okay. Say what?
You're the young looking.
All right. But I'll be 72 in December. Every young person you see, and for me, young people are 60 or below or whatever. Every young person you see, make sure you have a conversation with them about voting. I did phone banking, and every time I would have somebody, when I would have a conversation with them, I said, are there young people in your life? Are there other people in your life? Thank them and encourage them to go and vote. And the participation rate of young people in 2020 and 2022 did go up, particularly here in Gwinnett County. But have these conversations at your barbershop, at wherever you are, and there are others gathered, have these conversations. And we understand very clearly, at least I do, that when we vote, we are thinking about what the issues are. Is this person in support of those issues? So we're not about voting Democratic. Well, yes, we are, because they have usually been more consistent with the values that we, at least I, hold. And therefore, what we are voting for are the issues and the policies which we want to see pursued. So we must have these conversations with everybody that we encounter, and particularly those who are younger than we are. Encourage them. Believe that they will execute on that, and ask them, what is their plan? What is your plan? Do the phone banking as well.
We're actually doing voter registration in jails for people who haven't been convicted of a felony, as well as.
That would exclude Donald Trump.
Well. But we're just doing voter registration, and we're going back, giving them their absentee ballot because their caregivers can't take it in for them, so.
So I just want to thank everyone for this wonderful, wonderful conversation, and for being here today, and for engaging, and for believing and fighting for democracy. Thank you. Thank you so much.